The doors of the high chamber slammed shut behind me before I even understood what was happening. Every noble in the Koresh Dominion stood in a circle around the judgment floor, and every single one of them was looking at me the way you look at something broken that you are about to throw away. Chancellor Doran Vex did not waste time with kindness. He raised his hand, and the great screen above the throne lit up with my medical file, glowing red across the chamber for everyone to see. The word across the top of that file was the same word that had followed me since I was 16 years old. Barren. Rai Sethu. Touched by nothing. Useless to the bloodline. I stood there with my spine straight and my hands folded, because if I let them see me shake, they would talk about it for 100 years. My father, Emperor Vantor Koresh, did not look at me. He looked at the Chancellor instead, and that told me everything I needed to know about how this day would end. He had already decided. He had decided before I even walked into the room. The princess cannot bond with any of the 11 bloodlines, Chancellor Vex announced, his voice echoing off walls built from stone, older than my entire species' recorded memory. Her body rejects every match we have offered. She has cost this court 3 trade alliances and 2 marriage pacts. She is a stain on the Koresh name. A ripple of laughter moved through the nobles standing along the walls. Not loud laughter, the quiet, cruel kind that hurts more because it pretends to be polite. I felt my jaw tighten, but I did not speak. Speaking would only give them more to laugh at. There is, however, a use for her yet, the Chancellor continued, and now his mouth curled into something that was almost a smile. The humans have requested a diplomatic gesture to seal our new trade route, a member of the royal bloodline sent to their world as a symbol of goodwill. The chamber went silent for a heartbeat, and then the laughter returned, louder this time, because everyone in that room knew what the humans were. A species barely a few centuries into space travel, a species that had nearly destroyed their own world twice with their own wars before they figured out how to stop doing that. A species considered so far beneath the Dominion that most nobles could not even pronounce the name of their home planet correctly. Sending me there was not diplomacy. It was a punishment dressed up in fine words. It was banishment with a bow tied around it. Since she cannot serve the bloodline here, the Chancellor said, turning finally to look directly at me, let her serve it there. Perhaps the humans will find a barren princess more valuable than we do. More laughter. My father still did not look at me. I could have begged. I could have fallen to my knees and asked for another chance, another test, another year to prove myself worth keeping. I thought about it for exactly 1 second, and then I decided against it, because I already knew what my answer would be met with. Nothing. Silence. The same cold silence that had greeted every request I had made for the last 3 years. So instead, I lifted my chin and I said the only thing I had left to say. Then send me. The chamber went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. Surprised, uncertain. They had expected tears. They had expected me to shatter in front of them so they could feel powerful watching it happen. I refused to give them that. Chancellor Vex's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered it. Very well. The transport departs within the hour. You will take nothing from the royal treasury. You will take nothing but yourself. That is all I have ever needed, I said, and I turned and walked out of that chamber without looking back at my father, because I already knew his face would tell me nothing new. My attendant, a young woman named Kessa who had served my chambers since we were both children, met me in the hallway outside with tears already running down her face. She did not ask if I was all right. She already knew the answer. They think this is the end of you, she whispered, helping me gather what little I was permitted to bring. A joke, a punishment. They are already writing songs about it in the lower halls. Let them write their songs, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. Songs can be rewritten. I did not know, in that moment, how true those words would become. The transport ship was small and undecorated, nothing like the grand vessels that carried nobles to important gatherings. It was, I realized as I stepped aboard, Exactly the kind of ship you send when you want everyone at the destination to understand exactly how little you value what you are sending them. A message, wrapped inside a woman. I sat alone in the passenger hold as the engines rumbled to life beneath me, and I let myself feel it, finally, now that no one was watching. Not sadness. Something colder than sadness. Something that felt more like resolve hardening into shape. For 3 years, physicians across the Dominion had run me through test after test, trying to explain why my body refused to bond with any match presented to me. Not one of them had ever suggested the problem might not be me at all. Not one of them had looked past the word barren long enough to ask a better question. They had simply labeled me broken and moved on, because labeling me broken was easier than admitting their own science might have limits. I pressed my hand against the cold window of the transport as my homeworld shrank behind me into a small blue dot and then into nothing at all. Somewhere out there, an entire empire was laughing at the idea of me. An entire empire that had never once, not a single time, bothered to ask what I actually wanted or what I actually was. They believed they were sending away a broken piece of royalty to rot in obscurity on some backwater planet nobody important would ever visit. I did not know yet what waited for me on that planet. I did not know a species so many considered primitive would end up seeing something in me that an entire empire of supposedly advanced minds had somehow missed for years. But sitting there in that cold, undecorated ship, watching my home disappear into the dark, I made myself one promise. Whatever waited for me on the other end of this journey, I would not arrive as someone's punishment. I would arrive as myself, and I would decide, for the first time in my life, what that actually meant. The stars outside the window blurred into streaks of light as the ship entered its long jump toward a small, unremarkable planet called Earth. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since the judgment chamber doors had slammed behind me, I allowed myself a single, quiet breath. Whatever they thought they were sending away, I intended to prove them wrong. The journey took 11 days, and for most of them I did not sleep well. The ship's small crew, low-ranking soldiers assigned to a mission no one important wanted, mostly left me alone, which suited me fine. I spent the hours reading whatever files the Dominion had gathered on humans, and the more I read, the more confused I became. The reports described a species that argued constantly, questioned their own leaders openly, and somehow still managed to build cities that stretched toward their sky and machines that carried them across oceans in hours instead of weeks. The reports called this chaos. I began to wonder if it was something else entirely. On the 11th day, the ship's captain informed me we were beginning descent. I stood at the window and watched a green and blue world grow larger beneath us. And despite everything, despite the humiliation and the exile and the cold weight sitting in my chest since that judgment chamber, something in me leaned forward with curiosity instead of dread. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I was simply cataloging the details of my punishment. I did not yet know how wrong that thought would turn out to be. The ship landed on a stretch of open field surrounded by tall metal fences and flashing lights. And the moment the doors opened, I understood immediately that everything I had read on that 11-day journey had failed to prepare me for the reality of this place. Humans surrounded the landing site in numbers I had not expected. Soldiers in dark uniforms stood in careful lines, but they were not silent and rigid the way Dominion soldiers stood. They spoke to each other in low voices, some of them even laughing quietly at something one of their companions had said, right there in the middle of what was supposed to be a formal diplomatic reception. On my world, a soldier caught laughing during a ceremony would be removed from duty within the hour. Here, no one seemed to care at all. A man stepped forward from the crowd, tall and steady, wearing a simple gray coat instead of the ceremonial robes I had expected from whoever they sent to greet visiting royalty. He had dark hair, sharp eyes that studied me carefully but not unkindly, and he carried himself like someone who had learned patience the hard way. "Princess Vaith," he said, and his pronunciation of my name was clumsy, but he had clearly practiced it. "I'm Elias Grant. I've been assigned as your liaison while you're here. I studied him for a long moment before answering, trying to decide whether this was another version of the mockery I had left behind. A liaison, not a royal escort, a scientist's coat, not a diplomat's finery, another insult perhaps, disguised as hospitality. You do not sound pleased about the assignment, I said, testing him. To my surprise, he almost smiled. Honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect. Most of what we know about your people came from 3 trade meetings and a stack of translated documents nobody fully trusted. I figured I'd just ask you directly instead of guessing. No one on my world had ever simply asked me directly what I needed. They assumed, they judged, they labeled, and they moved forward without ever checking if their assumptions were correct. This man, this liaison, from a species my own people considered barely civilized, had just done something none of my own physicians, advisors, or family had ever bothered to do in 26 years. That is a novel approach, I said carefully. We're a novel species, he replied, and this time he did smile, just slightly. Come on, let's get you somewhere that isn't a landing field. You must be tired. I was not used to being asked if I was tired. I was used to being told what I would do next, regardless of how tired I was. I followed him anyway, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I had nothing else left to hold on to. The following days blurred together in a way I had not anticipated. Everything about human life seemed to move at a different rhythm than the rigid, ceremonial pace I had grown up inside. Meals were shared around tables where everyone spoke over each other. Meetings ended with people disagreeing loudly and then, somehow, still working together afterward without any apparent grudge. I watched a low-ranking soldier correct General Owen Hale's plan in front of an entire room, and instead of punishment, the general simply nodded and adjusted the plan. Does no one here fear consequences for speaking against their superiors? I asked Elias one evening as we walked along a corridor inside the research facility that had become my temporary residence. We fear plenty of things, he said. But we learned a long time ago that leaders who can't handle being questioned usually make worse decisions than the ones who can. Cost us a lot to learn that lesson, though. I thought of my father's silence in the judgment chamber, and I said nothing in response. It was on the 7th day that everything changed. A physician named Dr. Grace Bennett requested a full medical examination, standard practice, she explained, for any new arrival staying long-term at the facility. I agreed without much thought, expecting the same routine my Dominion physicians had run 100 times before. Blood analysis, genetic scans, the same tired conclusion waiting at the end of it. I sat in the small examination room while Dr. Bennett worked, her face illuminated by the glow of a screen displaying results I could not read. She was quiet for a long time, longer than I expected, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a strange, careful edge to it. Princess Vaith, can I ask you something? Your file says you were diagnosed as unable to bond with any genetic match from your own species. Did any physician ever test compatibility with a species outside your own before reaching that conclusion? The question caught me completely off guard. There was no reason to. Bonding outside the 11 bloodlines has never been attempted in recorded Dominion history. So the answer is no, she said, more to herself than to me, tapping something into her screen. Because based on what I'm seeing here, your reproductive system isn't malfunctioning at all. It's just incredibly specific. Your body isn't rejecting bonding in general, it's rejecting something very particular about the genetic markers unique to your own species' bloodlines. I sat very still, processing what she had just said. You are suggesting the failure was never in my body at all. I'm suggesting, Dr. Bennett said carefully, that somebody a long time ago ran one set of tests, got one specific result, and then never bothered to ask a second question, which frankly happens more than you'd think, even here on Earth. People fall in love with the first answer they find and stop looking for a better one. I felt something shift inside my chest, something I did not have a word for yet. For years, I had carried the word Barren like a stone tied around my neck, dragging me down through every court gathering, every whispered insult, every laugh that followed me down every hallway of my own home. And now, sitting in a small examination room on a planet my people mocked as primitive, a human physician had just casually suggested that the entire premise of my exile might have been built on an assumption nobody had ever properly tested. Why would my own physicians not consider this possibility? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Dr. Bennett looked at me with an expression that was somewhere between sympathy and frustration. Sometimes people don't look for answers they're not expecting to find, especially when the answer they already have is convenient enough for everyone else. Convenient. That word settled into me and stayed there. Convenient for the Chancellor, who had used my condition as an excuse to remove a royal daughter he had never trusted. Convenient for my father, who had never wanted the difficulty of finding me a match that might actually threaten the careful balance of power among the 11 bloodlines. Convenient for an entire court that preferred a simple label over a complicated truth. I did not sleep at all that night. I lay awake in the small guest quarters they had given me, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling on an unfamiliar world, replaying every cruel word, every quiet laugh, every year of feeling like the broken piece of a puzzle that nobody wanted to fit together properly. The next morning, I found Elias in the facility's common area, standing over a cup of dark liquid he called coffee, looking as though he had also not slept well. Dr. Bennett told me what she found, he said before I could speak. I hope that's all right. She wanted my input on next steps, since I'm your liaison. And what do you think the next steps should be? I asked. He set down his cup and looked at me directly, the same careful, honest way he had looked at me on the landing field. I think you deserve real answers, not more assumptions. If you're willing, we'd like to run a few more tests, this time actually asking the right questions instead of just confirming the wrong ones. Something about the way he said it, plainly, without pity, without mockery, without the polished cruelty I had grown so used to at home, made me realize I trusted him. Not completely, not yet, but enough to say yes. Very well, I said, ask your questions. He nodded, and for the first time since stepping off that transport ship, I felt something other than resignation settle into my chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. I did not yet understand how far that single word, hope, would carry me before this journey was finished. I only understood that for the first time in 3 long years, someone had looked at the label placed on me and asked whether it might simply be wrong. That question would change everything. The weeks that followed carried a strange, quiet rhythm I had never known before, and I found myself, more often than I liked to admit, looking forward to each new day instead of simply enduring it. Dr. Bennett ran her tests carefully, methodically, explaining each step before she took it, something no physician back home had ever bothered to do. She showed me the results as she found them, instead of hiding them behind sealed files only the court was permitted to view. For the first time in my life, I understood exactly what was happening inside my own body, instead of simply being told a conclusion by someone who expected me to accept it without question. Your genetic structure isn't damaged, she explained one afternoon, pointing to a chart glowing softly on her screen. It's just built differently than what your species' bonding process was designed to recognize. Think of it like a lock that was cut for a very specific, very narrow set of keys. Your body isn't broken. The keys they kept trying just never fit. Then what would fit? I asked, and I was surprised by how much I wanted to know the answer. She hesitated, glancing toward the doorway where Elias stood listening, arms crossed, expression unreadable. That's actually the interesting part. Based on the compatibility markers we're seeing, your biology shows a much closer match to human genetic structure than to your own species' narrow bonding requirements. It's rare. Cross-species compatibility this close basically never happens by chance, but it's there. I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle strangely inside my chest. Not fear, not exactly hope either, something more complicated, sitting somewhere in between. You are saying the very thing my people used to discard me, I said slowly, might be the very thing that makes me valuable somewhere else. I'm saying your people looked at an incomplete picture and called it the whole truth. Dr. Bennett said gently. That happens more than it should, everywhere, not just with your court. Over the following days, I spent more time with Elias than with anyone else at the facility. At first, it was simply necessity, since he remained assigned as my liaison and needed to accompany me through most of the ongoing research. But somewhere along the way, necessity slowly became something else, something I did not have a proper word for in either his language or mine. He taught me things that had nothing to do with diplomacy or genetics. He taught me sarcasm, a strange human habit of saying the opposite of what you meant, while somehow still being understood correctly. He taught me the rules of a card game his soldiers played during their off hours, and he laughed, actually laughed, the first time I won by accident because I had misunderstood the rules entirely and stumbled into victory anyway. You're terrifying at this game, he said, shaking his head while the soldiers around the table groaned good-naturedly. I almost feel bad for whoever has to play against you once you actually learn the rules properly. I have been called many things, I said, allowing myself the smallest smile. Terrifying is a new one. In return, I taught him things about my world he had never read in any translated document. I taught him how to read the careful, coded language of Dominion court politics, how a compliment could carry a threat buried inside it, how silence could be sharper than any spoken insult. I explained how my father's refusal to look at me during my sentencing had been its own kind of statement, one that anyone raised in that court would have understood instantly. That's rough, Elias said quietly when I finished explaining it. My father wasn't exactly warm either, but at least he yelled at me directly instead of pretending I wasn't standing in the room. Perhaps that is progress, I said. A father who yells is at least admitting you exist. He looked at me for a long moment after that, something shifting behind his eyes that I did not fully understand yet, and he did not say anything else on the subject. It was General Owen Hale who finally proposed the formal compatibility trials, 3 weeks after Dr. Bennett's initial discovery. He gathered a small team, careful and measured, explaining every step before it happened, nothing like the cold, clinical process I remembered from my own physicians back home. There was no laughter behind closed doors here, no whispered jokes about the Barren princess finally getting what she deserved. Only careful, patient science, treating my body like a puzzle worth understanding instead of a problem worth discarding. We want to be completely clear about something, General Hale said to me the morning the trials were scheduled to begin, his voice steady and direct. Nobody here is pressuring you into anything. If at any point you want to stop, you say the word, and we stop. This isn't a diplomatic obligation. This is your choice, and only your choice. I had never, in 26 years of royal life, been given that kind of clear, uncomplicated permission to simply choose for myself. I felt something tighten in my throat, and I nodded instead of trusting my voice to answer properly. Thank you, I finally managed, for asking instead of assuming. The trials themselves were careful and respectful, nothing like the cold, clinical humiliation I had feared based on my experiences at home. And when the results finally came back, weeks later, Dr. Bennett called both myself and Elias into her office together, her expression carefully composed but her eyes bright with something that looked almost like excitement. The compatibility markers are strong, she said, sliding the results across her desk toward us. Stronger than strong, actually. In all my years of research, I've never seen numbers like this. Whatever your body was built for, Princess Vaith, it wasn't your own species' bloodlines, it was something else entirely. I stared at the numbers on the page, numbers that meant very little to me technically, but the weight of their meaning settled into me all the same. Everything I had been told for 3 long years, every cold conclusion, every cruel label, every quiet laugh in every hallway back home, had been built on an assumption nobody had ever properly questioned. They called me broken, I said quietly, mostly to myself. They exiled me for being broken, and the truth was simply that they never bothered to look in the right direction. Elias was quiet beside me for a long moment before he spoke. For what it's worth, I don't think you were ever broken. I think you were just waiting for someone to actually pay attention." I looked up at him, and something inside me, something I had kept carefully guarded since that judgment chamber sealed its doors behind me, finally allowed itself to soften, just slightly. The weeks that followed were not simple, and I will not pretend they were. There were long nights where I sat awake, mourning years spent believing a lie about my own body, grieving a version of myself I might have become if someone, anyone, back home had simply asked the right questions sooner. There was anger, too, sharp and sudden, arriving at unexpected moments, aimed at a court that had discarded me so easily, so carelessly, without ever considering they might be wrong. Elias never rushed me through any of it. He sat with me during the quiet nights when the anger came, and he did not try to fix it or explain it away. He simply stayed, steady and patient, the way he had been since the moment I stepped off that transport ship, expecting mockery and finding, instead, something closer to genuine curiosity. "You know," he said one evening, as we sat together on the edge of the research facility's rooftop, watching the unfamiliar stars scattered across an unfamiliar sky. "Back home, on my planet, we spent centuries fighting wars over things that turned out to be built on assumptions just as wrong as the ones your people made about you. Whole nations convinced themselves they understood something completely, right up until someone finally asked the question nobody else had bothered to ask. And did asking the question help? I asked. Eventually, he said. Cost us a lot to get there, though. I think that's just how it works. Progress usually starts with somebody finally admitting they might have been wrong the whole time. I thought about my father's silence, and the chancellor's smile, and an entire court laughing at a woman they had never properly understood, and I thought about how strange it was that the answer to that lifelong wound had waited for me on a planet my own people considered too primitive to matter. I do not think I am ready to forgive them, I admitted quietly. Not yet. Perhaps not for a long time. You don't have to be, Elias said simply. Forgiveness isn't a requirement. It's just an option, if you ever decide you want it. We sat together in comfortable silence after that, and somewhere in that silence, beneath an unfamiliar sky on a planet that had never once made me feel small, I realized something had shifted permanently inside me. I was no longer simply surviving my exile. I was, for the first time since that judgment chamber sealed its doors behind me, actually beginning to heal. And healing, I was slowly learning, was not the same thing as forgetting. It was simply the process of finally being seen clearly, perhaps for the very first time in my entire life, by people who had never once decided in advance what I was worth. Months passed in this quiet, careful way, and somewhere along that path, without either of us fully announcing it, my bond with Elias deepened into something neither science nor diplomacy could fully explain. It simply was, steady and certain, the way morning light arrives whether or not anyone is watching for it. When Dr. Bennett confirmed, quietly and carefully, months later, that I was carrying not one child but two, I did not feel the fear I once imagined I would feel if this impossible outcome ever became real. I felt something closer to quiet, fierce triumph. Because somewhere across the stars, an entire empire had called me Barren and thrown me away like something broken beyond repair. And here I was, proving, with every steady heartbeat inside me, exactly how wrong they had been. The message I sent to the Dominion Court requested nothing. It announced everything. I did not ask permission to return. I did not request an audience or wait for an invitation. I simply informed the court, through the same formal channels they had once used to announce my exile, that Princess Vaith Sol Koresh would be arriving within the week, accompanied by a human diplomatic escort, to address matters of significant importance to the bloodline. Elias stood beside me as I finished recording the message, his expression carefully neutral, though I could see the tension in his shoulders. "You're sure about this?" "I have never been more certain of anything," I said, resting a hand against the gentle curve of my stomach. "They believed they were sending away something broken. I intend to correct that belief in person. General Hale had offered a full military escort, but I declined it. This was not a mission that required force. It required only truth, delivered plainly, in front of every person who had once laughed at my expense. The ship that carried us back was nothing like the small, undecorated transport that had once carried me away in shame. This was a human vessel, sleek and well-built, piloted by a human crew, arriving at the Dominion's central docking station under full diplomatic clearance. I watched through the window as the familiar shapes of my homeworld grew larger ahead of us, and I felt none of the dread I once imagined I would feel returning to this place. I felt only steady, quiet resolve. The docking station fell into stunned silence the moment we disembarked. Nobles who had gathered out of curiosity, drawn by the strange announcement of my return, stared openly as I stepped off a human vessel, visibly and unmistakably pregnant, with Elias walking calmly beside me. Whispers spread through the crowd faster than any official announcement could have traveled, and I let them whisper. Let them see exactly what they had discarded, standing tall and unbroken in front of them. Chancellor Doran Vex arrived within the hour, his composed expression cracking slightly the moment he saw me. "Princess Vaith, this is unexpected." "Is it?" I asked, meeting his eyes directly, something I had rarely dared to do during my years at court. "You sent me away expecting nothing to come of it. I have simply come to correct that expectation." He recovered his composure quickly, though I noticed his eyes flicker briefly, calculating, toward the visible evidence of my condition. "The court will need to convene, of course. This is a matter requiring careful consideration." "Convene it, then," I said calmly. "I have no objection to an audience. In fact, I insist upon one." The judgment chamber looked exactly as I remembered it, cold stone walls stretching upward into shadow, the same circle of nobles gathering along the edges to watch whatever spectacle was about to unfold. My father sat upon the throne, and for the first time since my childhood, I watched him struggle to maintain his composed, distant expression as I walked into that chamber, unmistakably carrying new life within me, flanked by a human liaison the court had once considered beneath their notice. "Father," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent chamber. "I understand my absence has been eventful for the court to discuss." He did not answer immediately. I watched something complicated move behind his eyes, something that might have been surprise, or shame, or perhaps simply the slow, uncomfortable process of recalculating everything he had once believed certain. "You were declared unable to bond," Chancellor Vex said quickly, stepping forward to fill the silence, his voice carrying a defensive edge now, instead of the smug confidence I remembered from my sentencing. The physicians confirmed this repeatedly, across multiple examinations. The physicians confirmed I could not bond with the 11 Dominion bloodlines, I corrected, my voice steady and clear. Not one of them ever tested compatibility beyond our own species, because not one of them considered it worth asking. It took a single human physician, on a world your own court dismissed as primitive, less than a week to ask the question none of you managed to ask across 3 entire years. I let it settle before continuing. "You called me Barren," I said, turning slowly to address the entire chamber, letting my voice fill every corner of that cold stone room. "You called me broken and useless and a stain upon this family's name. You sent me away as a punishment, dressed up as diplomacy, expecting me to disappear quietly into irrelevance on a planet you considered far beneath your notice." I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting every noble in that chamber sit with the weight of what I was about to say next. Instead, that planet's physicians discovered in days what this entire court failed to discover across years, and now I stand before you, carrying not one heir, but 2, proof that the very thing you discarded me for was never the truth at all. It was simply a convenient lie, easier to accept than the harder work of actually understanding me. Chancellor Vex's face had gone pale, his earlier composure entirely abandoned now. "This is unprecedented. A hybrid bloodline has never existed within Dominion history." "Then perhaps," I said, "it is time the Dominion's history learned to expand." I turned finally to my father, who still had not spoken a single word since I entered the chamber. You did not look at me the day you sent me away. I understood at the time that your silence was its own kind of judgment. I would ask, now, that you look at me properly, for perhaps the first time in either of our lives. Slowly, deliberately, my father rose from his throne. The entire chamber held its breath as he descended the steps toward me, his expression unreadable, until he finally stood close enough that I could see the complicated mixture of emotions moving behind his tired eyes. "I did not send you away because I believed you were broken," he said quietly, his voice carrying only far enough for those closest to hear. "I sent you away because I did not have the strength to fight a court that had already decided your fate before I ever entered that chamber. That failure belongs to me, not to you." It was not the apology I had once imagined receiving, back when I still allowed myself to imagine such things. It was smaller, more complicated, and far more honest than anything I had expected from him. I found, to my own surprise, that I did not need it to be grand or perfect. I simply needed it to be true. "I did not return today for an apology," I said. "I returned to correct a lie this court accepted far too easily. What you choose to do with that truth now belongs entirely to you." Chancellor Vex, sensing the shifting mood of the chamber, attempted one final effort to regain control. "The bloodline laws are clear. Any heir must be confirmed through proper genetic verification before being granted royal standing. A hybrid heir has no precedent within our laws." "Then write a new precedent," Elias said, speaking for the first time since entering the chamber, his voice calm but carrying easily across the silent room. "Your laws were written by people who never imagined this possibility, because they never bothered looking beyond their own assumptions. Seems to me that's exactly the kind of law worth reconsidering." The Chancellor turned toward him, clearly startled that a human liaison would dare speak directly within a Dominion judgment chamber. "You are not permitted to address this court directly." "With respect," Elias said, still perfectly calm, "your own princess just proved your physicians wrong about something they insisted was certain for 3 straight years. Might be worth considering that maybe you don't have all the answers you think you do." A long silence followed his words, heavier and more uncertain than any silence that had filled that chamber during my original sentencing. I watched several of the nobles exchange careful glances, the same nobles who had laughed so easily at my exile, now visibly reconsidering the certainty of everything they had once believed about the world beyond their own. My father finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of a decision he had clearly been considering carefully. "The Koresh bloodline will recognize Princess Vaith's heirs, regardless of their hybrid nature. Any noble wishing to challenge this decision may bring their objection to me directly, rather than hiding behind whispered court gossip." Chancellor Vex's mouth opened, then closed again, clearly recognizing the shifted balance of power in that chamber, and choosing, wisely, not to press the matter further in front of an audience no longer fully on his side. I felt something settle inside me then, quiet and steady, as I stood in that chamber that had once discarded me so easily. I had not returned seeking revenge, and I had not found the satisfaction I once imagined revenge might bring. I had found something better. I had found truth, delivered plainly, in front of every person who had once believed a convenient lie about who I was. As the chamber slowly began to empty, nobles departing in careful, uncertain silence, I felt Elias's hand find mine, steady and warm, grounding me in a moment that felt simultaneously like an ending and a beginning. "You did good," he said quietly. "We did good," I corrected, glancing toward him with something that felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, dangerously close to peace. Whatever came next, whatever complicated path lay ahead for a hybrid bloodline within an empire still learning to reconsider its own certainties, I understood one thing clearly as I stood in that chamber, surrounded by the ruins of an old, convenient lie. I had not returned as someone's punishment. I had returned as exactly who I always was, finally seen clearly, for the very first time. The months following our return to the Dominion were not simple, and I never expected them to be. Old certainties do not unravel quietly. especially within a court built upon centuries of careful, rigid tradition. But something had shifted permanently the day I walked back into that judgment chamber, and no amount of quiet grumbling among the nobility could undo what had already been witnessed by every person in that room. My father, in the weeks that followed, surprised me in small, careful ways. He requested regular updates on the pregnancy, not through formal channels or distant messengers, but in person, sitting across from me in the same quiet study where I remembered playing as a small child, before the weight of court politics had settled fully onto my shoulders. He never became the warm, openly affectionate father I sometimes allowed myself to imagine in quieter moments. But he tried, in his own careful, complicated way, and I found I no longer needed him to be perfect. I simply needed him to keep trying. Chancellor Vex, to no one's great surprise, did not remain in his position for long. Whispers moved quickly through court once nobles began quietly reconsidering every other conclusion he had confidently delivered over the years, and within 2 months he was quietly replaced by a younger advisor with considerably less patience for convenient lies. I did not celebrate his removal. I simply noted it, the way you note the closing of an old wound finally beginning to heal properly. Dr. Bennett arrived at the Dominion Palace midway through my final month, invited formally by my father himself, who wished to understand precisely how his own physicians had missed something a human researcher discovered within days. She spent weeks working alongside Dominion medical staff, patiently walking them through her findings, teaching methods of careful, curious inquiry that stood in sharp contrast to the rigid, assumption-driven practices they had relied upon for generations. "Your physicians aren't incompetent," she told me one evening, as we sat together in the palace gardens, watching the twin moons rise slowly over the horizon. "They're just trained to look for confirmation instead of looking for actual answers. It's an easy trap to fall into, honestly. Happens on my world too, more often than we'd like to admit." "Do you believe they will change?" I asked. "Some will," she said honestly. "Some won't. Change is slow, even when the proof is standing right in front of you. But you gave them proof they can't easily ignore anymore. That's a start." I found comfort in her honesty, the same steady, uncomplicated honesty I had come to rely upon during my months on Earth. It was strange, I thought, how a species my own people had once dismissed so easily had taught me more about genuine care and careful truth than an entire empire I had been born into. The twins arrived on a quiet morning, without ceremony or grand announcement, exactly the way I had hoped for after enduring so many years of my life, dictated by rigid Dominion tradition. A daughter first, whom I named Lyra, carrying a small tuft of dark hair unmistakably inherited from her father, alongside pale, luminous Dominion eyes that seemed to catch and hold every bit of light in the room. A son followed shortly after, whom I named Cade, carrying the opposite combination, human-colored eyes, set within features unmistakably shaped by Dominion bloodlines. Elias held them both, one cradled carefully in each arm, and I watched something shift permanently across his face. Wonder and fear and fierce protectiveness all tangled together in a way I recognized instantly, because I imagined my own expression mirrored his completely. "They're perfect," he said quietly, and I did not correct him, because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I agreed completely with a simple, uncomplicated statement about something concerning my own life. News of the twins' arrival spread quickly through Dominion space, and the reaction split predictably along old familiar lines. Some nobles remained quietly resistant, uncomfortable with a hybrid bloodline challenging centuries of careful tradition. Others, particularly the younger generation who had grown tired of rigid customs long before my exile ever occurred, embraced the news with genuine curiosity, eager to understand what this unprecedented development might mean for the Empire's future. What surprised me most, in the months that followed, was Earth's own reaction. What had once been dismissed as a minor trade agreement between a powerful empire and a primitive backwater world suddenly commanded serious attention from every corner of Dominion space. No longer could any noble comfortably dismiss humans as beneath consideration. Not when a human physician's simple curiosity had solved a mystery Dominion science had failed to properly investigate for years, and not when a human diplomatic escort had stood calmly within a royal judgment chamber and successfully challenged centuries of rigid legal tradition. General Hale, when I spoke with him through a long-distance communication several months after the twins' birth, seemed both amused and cautiously optimistic about the shifting dynamic. Funny how quickly people change their minds about who deserves respect once they realize ignoring someone might cost them something valuable, he said. Not the most flattering reason to earn respect, but I'll take it if it means fewer people getting hurt along the way. I thought often, during those quiet months of new motherhood, about the woman I had been standing in that cold judgment chamber, accepting exile with as much dignity as I could manage, never once imagining the path that lay ahead of me. I thought about every quiet laugh, every cruel whisper, every year spent believing a convenient lie about my own body, simply because no one important enough had bothered questioning it sooner. I did not forget those years. I did not pretend the wounds they left behind had simply disappeared because my life had eventually taken a better path. But I found, slowly and carefully, that I no longer needed to carry them as heavily as I once had. They had shaped me, certainly, but they no longer defined me, not the way they once had inside that cold stone chamber. Lyra and Cade grew quickly, as children do, splitting their early years between the careful formality of Dominion Palace life and increasingly frequent visits to Earth, where Elias insisted they experience both halves of their unusual heritage properly. I watched them learn Dominion court etiquette alongside human card games, watched them switch effortlessly between languages that had once seemed impossibly foreign to each other, watched them grow into something entirely new, belonging fully to neither world completely, yet welcomed increasingly by both. "They're going to change everything eventually," Elias said one evening as we watched the twins chase each other across the palace gardens, their laughter echoing off ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of rigid, unchanging tradition before finally being forced to make room for something unprecedented. "They already have," I said quietly, watching my daughter's Dominion eyes catch the fading evening light, while my son's human-colored eyes crinkled with laughter, identical to his father's. "The rest of the Empire simply hasn't fully realized it yet." I often thought back to that final moment aboard the small, undecorated transport ship carrying me away from everything I had ever known, watching my home world shrink into a small blue dot before disappearing into the vast darkness beyond. I remembered the promise I made myself in that moment, quiet and fierce, refusing to arrive at my destination as anyone's punishment. I had kept that promise, though not in any way I could have predicted during that long, uncertain journey. I had not returned triumphant through conquest or revenge. I had returned through something far more powerful and far more difficult to dismiss. I had returned through simple, patient truth, discovered by people willing to ask questions an entire empire had never bothered asking. An empire that once called me broken now found itself forced to reconsider centuries of careful certainty, all because a small research team on a planet they once dismissed as primitive chose curiosity over convenient assumption. I do not know what the future holds for Lyra and Cade, born into a heritage unlike anything either of their worlds had previously known. I know only that they will grow up understanding something I spent 26 painful years learning far too slowly. Worth is never something other people are entitled to decide for you, no matter how confidently they deliver their conclusions, no matter how many quiet laughs follow you down every hallway of your own home. Sometimes, the truth simply waits patiently for someone brave enough, or curious enough, or kind enough to finally ask the right question. I was fortunate enough to find people willing to ask, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain my children never have to wait as long as I did to be truly seen.